In the quiet neighborhood of Maplewood, where the sun seemed to always shine just right and the air smelled faintly of blooming flowers, life moved at a peaceful pace. Kids rode their bikes along the winding streets, families walked their dogs, and neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles. It was a place where everyone felt safe, where nothing too out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. But that all changed one afternoon, in a way no one could have predicted. Meet Emma, a curious and adventurous 4-year-old who loved exploring the world around her. She had a boundless energy that kept her parents, Sarah and Mark, on their toes. With her bright eyes and curly brown hair, Emma was always discovering something new, whether it was a pretty rock, a colorful leaf, or a hidden corner in the backyard. But the real star of this story is someone you might not expect, Oliver, the family's fluffy orange tabby cat. Oliver had been part of the family for as long as Emma could remember. He was a gentle, laid-back cat, more interested in naps and chasing sunbeams than anything else. But like many cats, Oliver had a mysterious side, an instinct that went deeper than his sleepy demeanor. No one could have guessed that this calm, seemingly ordinary cat would soon be thrust into the role of an unlikely hero. It was a warm afternoon in early autumn, the kind of day that invites kids to play outside until the sun starts to dip behind the trees. Emma, as usual, was exploring the backyard while Sarah tidied up the house and kept an eye on her through the kitchen window. Oliver was lounging on the porch, lazily stretching out in the golden sunlight. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just another peaceful day in Maplewood. But then something changed. Emma, driven by her usual curiosity, wandered farther into the yard, toward a section of the fence that had a small gap at the bottom. Her parents had always told her to stay away from that spot, but the temptation to see what was on the other side had finally gotten the best of her. Without a second thought, she squeezed through the gap and found herself in the neighboring woods, a place she had never been before.
For a 4-year-old, the woods were like a whole new world.
Tall trees towered above her, and the ground was covered in a soft layer of leaves and twigs. Emma giggled as she stomped around, her little boots making a satisfying crunch with every step. But soon the trees seemed to close in, and the familiar sounds of the backyard faded. Emma, now a little less sure of herself, glanced around, realizing she had wandered too far. Back at the house, Sarah glanced out the window, expecting to see Emma playing in her usual spot. But the yard was empty. Panic began to bubble up inside her. "Emma," she called, her voice louder than she intended. No response. That's when Oliver, who had been lazily perched on the porch, suddenly became alert. His ears perked up, and he stood, staring intently at the spot where Emma had disappeared. It was as if something deep within him had switched on, a sense, an instinct, that told him something wasn't right. Without hesitation, Oliver darted toward the woods, his movements swift and purposeful. Sarah, still calling Emma's name, didn't notice the cat's sudden departure. But Oliver was already on the move, following a trail only he could sense. Emma, meanwhile, had ventured deeper into the woods than she realized. The trees were thicker here, and the light was dimmer. She called out for her mom, her voice small and uncertain. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard something that made her freeze in place. A rustling sound, low and close, came from behind her. She slowly turned, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw sent a jolt of fear through her tiny body. In the shadows, not too far from where she stood, was a pair of gleaming eyes. They stared at her, unblinking, as the creature shifted in the underbrush. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it wasn't friendly. The woods, which had seemed so fun just moments ago, now felt cold and frightening. Back at the house, Sarah was frantically searching the yard, her heart racing with every second that passed without finding Emma. She was just about to run into the woods when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. Oliver, racing back toward the house. And he wasn't alone. There, clutched gently in his mouth, was a small, familiar piece of Emma's jacket. Oliver dropped it at Sarah's feet, looking up at her with an urgency she had never seen in him before. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what Oliver was trying to tell her. Emma was in trouble. And Oliver, their sleepy, easygoing cat, was the only one who knew where she was. With the jacket in her hand and fear gripping her heart, Sarah followed Oliver, who wasted no time leading her toward the gap in the fence. What awaited them in the woods was a mystery, but one thing was certain. Time was running out, and Emma needed to be found. As Oliver darted ahead, Sarah could only hope they weren't too late. The woods were quiet, but that eerie quiet only made her more anxious. What had happened to Emma? And what was waiting for them on the other side of those trees? The answer was closer than they knew, and it would change everything. The woods felt darker now, almost as if they were closing in around Sarah as she followed Oliver. The tall trees seemed to whisper secrets, the branches swaying gently in the breeze, but there was no comfort in that sound. Every step Sarah took felt heavy, her heart pounding in her chest as her mind raced with worst-case scenarios. She gripped Emma's tiny jacket in her hand, the familiar fabric already stained with dirt and leaves, making it feel like a lifeline to her daughter. Oliver moved quickly ahead, his orange fur darting through the patches of light filtering down through the branches. He was acting like a completely different animal now, as if this was his moment, his time to step up and protect the family he had always quietly watched over. Sarah had never seen him like this, so focused, so determined. It was almost as if he could sense something deeper in the woods, something dangerous. But what? Sarah's mind flashed back to earlier that week. There had been strange stories going around the neighborhood. A few people had mentioned seeing animals acting oddly, deer staring at people from the tree line as if they were waiting for something, and birds gathering in unusual numbers, their black eyes fixed on the houses. At the time, she had brushed it off as nothing. The town was small, and sometimes people let their imaginations get the best of them. But now, with each step deeper into the woods, she wondered if there was more truth to those stories than she wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Emma was still standing frozen, her little heart racing as she stared at the pair of eyes in the underbrush. She didn't know what to do. Her feet felt glued to the ground, and her voice had caught in her throat. She wanted to scream for her mom, but the fear had turned her silent. Whatever was watching her wasn't moving, but it didn't need to. The weight of its stare was enough to make the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. But just as quickly as the fear had paralyzed her, a sudden rustling behind her made Emma spin around. She gasped in relief. There, trotting toward her with surprising speed, was Oliver. His golden eyes were locked onto her, and for a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But then she heard it. A low growl, deep and rumbling, coming from where the eyes had been. Oliver hissed loudly, his fur standing on end, and quickly placed himself between Emma and the creature lurking in the shadows. The little girl felt her breath catch again as she clutched the edges of her coat, holding it close like a shield. She knew Oliver was trying to protect her, but what could a cat possibly do against something so big, so threatening? The growl grew louder, more menacing, and Emma took a shaky step back, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she trusted Oliver. He had always been there for her, always looked out for her in his quiet, cat-like way. But this felt different. This felt like a real danger. Sarah was only a few yards away now, her breath quickening as she heard the distant growl echoing through the trees. She pushed herself forward, fear gripping her tightly. In her mind, she kept repeating Emma's name over and over, praying that her little girl was okay, that Oliver had found her in time. The woods were closing in around her, the air thick with tension, but she wouldn't stop. Not until she had Emma safe in her arms again. As Sarah rounded the last tree, she saw them. Emma, standing just a few feet away, and Oliver, his back arched, fur bristling as he stared down something in the darkness. Sarah couldn't see what it was, but she could feel it. The air had changed. The quiet of the woods now filled with something dark and dangerous. She could sense the presence lurking just beyond her sight, and a wave of panic crashed over her. "Emma!" she called out, her voice shaking but loud enough to reach her daughter. Emma turned to see her mom running toward her. And for the first time since stepping into the woods, she felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly shattered as the growling grew louder, followed by the sound of something moving, a slow, deliberate step forward. The creature was coming closer. Sarah didn't wait. She rushed forward, scooping Emma into her arms and holding her close, her heart pounding in her chest as she turned to face the darkness. Oliver stood his ground, refusing to budge even as the tension thickened around them. The growling stopped, replaced by a heavy, eerie silence. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like they were caught in a dangerous stillness waiting for something to happen. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. She had no idea what was lurking in the woods, no idea why Oliver had been so intent on bringing her here. But deep down, she knew they weren't safe yet. Whatever it was still out there, watching them, waiting. Suddenly, Oliver let out a sharp yowl, and before Sarah could react, he darted forward into the shadows, disappearing from sight. Sarah's breath caught as she clutched Emma tighter, unsure of what to do. She wanted to follow him, to find out what was happening, but fear held her in place. Seconds passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then in the distance there was a sudden crash, a loud, splintering sound, as if something heavy had fallen. The woods trembled with the noise, and Sarah felt her grip tighten around Emma, her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get out of there as fast as she could. But she couldn't leave Oliver. He had led her here for a reason. He had protected Emma. And now he was out there, somewhere in the darkness, facing whatever danger had been stalking them. "Oliver!" she shouted into the woods, her voice cracking with desperation. There was no response. The stillness returned, but this time it felt heavier, more oppressive. Sarah stood frozen, torn between her instincts to flee and her need to find their cat. Emma clung to her, burying her face in her mom's shoulder, too scared to say a word. Then, out of the silence, there was a faint sound, a soft, almost pitiful meow. Sarah's heart leapt. It was Oliver. But where was he? She turned, searching the trees, her eyes darting through the shadows. The meow came again, a little louder this time, and she followed the sound, her footsteps hesitant but determined. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her, but she kept going, guided by Oliver's faint cries. He was close. She just had to keep going. Finally, she saw him, Oliver sitting at the base of a tree, his fur matted and dirty, but otherwise unharmed. He looked up at her with wide eyes, his body tense as if he was still on high alert. But there was something else there, too. Something in the way he stared at her that made Sarah's stomach twist with unease. Because behind Oliver, just barely visible in the dim light, was something she hadn't expected. The ground around the tree was disturbed, the earth dug up and scattered, as if something or someone had been here before them. And the realization hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. They weren't alone in these woods. Not now, and maybe not ever. Sarah's heart raced as she stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the disturbed earth beneath the tree. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to leave, to take Emma and run far away from whatever had left this strange, unsettling mark on the ground. But she couldn't move. Her feet felt as if they were rooted to the spot, caught between her fear and the need to protect her child and Oliver. Oliver didn't budge from his position near the base of the tree, his eyes wide and alert. He kept glancing between Sarah and the darkening woods, as if urging her to understand something she couldn't yet grasp. His fur was still on edge, his tail flicking nervously. He wasn't acting like the calm, lazy cat they knew. He was on guard, as if sensing danger they couldn't see. Emma, sensing her mother's fear, tightened her grip around Sarah's neck, her small body trembling. "Mommy, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the growing tension around them. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "It's okay, baby," she said, though the tremor in her words betrayed her own fear. "We're going to be okay. I just need to figure out what's going on." But even as she spoke, she knew she wasn't convincing either of them. The woods seemed darker now, the trees casting long, eerie shadows that stretched toward them like fingers. The silence was thick and unnatural, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant creak of branches swaying in the breeze. Something was watching them. Sarah could feel it. There was no mistaking the weight of unseen eyes. She turned in a slow circle, her breath quickening as she scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness and the growing sense of dread in her chest. Oliver, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. What is it? What do you see? But Oliver only stared back at her, his golden eyes wide and unblinking. He wasn't leaving the tree, and that fact alone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. He wasn't leading them away from the danger this time. He was staying put, as if this was where they needed to be. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl, deeper than before, echoing through the trees like a warning. It was closer now, much closer. Sarah's pulse quickened, her grip on Emma tightening as she took a step back, her gaze darting wildly through the shadows. "Mommy?" Emma cried, panic rising in her voice. "I'm here, Emma. I'm right here." Sarah's voice was firm, though her mind was spinning. She had to stay calm. She had to keep Emma safe. But how? Whatever was out there, it was coming for them. She could feel the tension mounting like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. The growl came again, closer still, and this time there was movement, just at the edge of her vision. A flash of something dark and low to the ground, slinking through the underbrush. It was too fast for her to make out clearly, but it was there, circling them. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. They needed to get out of there, now. "Oliver, come on!" she urged, her voice shaking as she took a step back. "We need to go!" But Oliver stayed where he was, his gaze fixed on the darkness behind the tree. He let out a low, guttural hiss, his ears flattened against his head. Something was coming. Something he was standing guard against. The air grew heavier, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The growl shifted into a series of guttural sounds, almost like distorted whispers carried on the wind. Sarah's skin prickled with fear. This was no ordinary animal stalking them. This was something else, something far more dangerous and far more intelligent. She turned toward the woods, her eyes frantically scanning the trees. There, just beyond the tree line, she saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving slowly through the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to make out its shape, but the thickening gloom made it impossible to see clearly. All she could make out was its size, towering over her, its movements slow and deliberate. Whatever it wasn't afraid. It was stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah took another step back, clutching Emma tightly. She couldn't run blindly into the woods, not with something so close, but staying here felt like an equally deadly choice. The presence, that strange, suffocating weight of being watched, pressed down on her, and she could feel the danger creeping closer with every breath. And then, without warning, the creature stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was larger than Sarah had imagined, its form hulking and unnatural. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, two glowing orbs that locked onto her with terrifying intensity. Its skin, or was it fur, seemed to shimmer in the faint light, shifting between darkness and something else, something Sarah couldn't quite place. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Oliver let out another fierce hiss, and this time the creature paused, its gaze shifting toward the cat. For a brief moment, there was a strange stillness, a moment of tension so thick it felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything she could explain. But whatever it was there for them. The creature took a step closer, its massive form looming over them. The ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to tremble with each movement it made. Emma buried her face in Sarah's shoulder, whimpering softly as she clung to her mother. Sarah's entire body was shaking, every instinct in her screaming to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The creature's eyes flickered once more, shifting between Emma, Sarah, and Oliver. There was a strange intelligence behind those eyes, something calculating, something almost aware. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It didn't move closer. It didn't attack. It simply stood there, watching them, its eyes glowing in the growing darkness. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The woods were silent again, save for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. The creature stood still, its gaze locked onto them, but it made no move to strike. And then, without warning, Oliver took a step forward. He stood his ground, his small body dwarfed by the creature looming above them. His tail flicked and his eyes never left the figure. In that moment, Sarah understood. Oliver wasn't just protecting them, he was challenging it. Whatever this thing was Whatever had been stalking them, Oliver was standing in its way, making it clear that it wouldn't get past him. The tension in the air crackled like electricity. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the creature to react, for the moment when everything would come crashing down around them. But instead, the creature let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed almost frustrated. Its glowing eyes flickered once more, and then, slowly, it began to retreat. It stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as it had come. Sarah's knees buckled with relief, her breath coming in short, gasping bursts as the adrenaline finally caught up with her. She held Emma tightly, unable to process what had just happened. The creature was gone, but the fear still clung to her, the weight of its presence lingering in the air. Oliver, too, seemed to relax, his fur slowly flattening as the danger passed. He turned to look at Sarah, his golden eyes softening, but there was something else there, too. Something Sarah couldn't quite understand. It was as if he knew more than he could ever tell her. They had made it through, but Sarah knew deep down that whatever had just happened wasn't over. Not yet. Just as the tension in Sarah's body began to ease, a sudden rustling sound echoed through the trees. Her heart, which had only just begun to slow, raced back into overdrive. She spun around, clutching Emma close, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the creature that had just disappeared. But the sound wasn't coming from the direction where the figure had vanished. It was coming from the opposite side of the clearing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized something. Whatever had been stalking them might not have been alone. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if something, or someone, was moving quickly toward them. Oliver's ears perked up again, his body tensing, his golden eyes darting toward the sound. He hadn't relaxed for long. He was back on high alert, his tail flicking with agitation. Sarah took a step back, her pulse quickening. The woods, which had briefly seemed to release them from its grip, now felt alive with movement. The shadows shifted in the dim light, and the familiar feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The sense of dread in her chest grew heavier, almost suffocating. "Mommy, what is it? Is it coming back?" Emma's voice was a frightened whisper, her small hands gripping Sarah's jacket tightly. "I don't know, baby," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But we need to be ready. Stay close." Suddenly there was a snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. It was much closer now, too close. Sarah turned toward the noise, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She could feel the adrenaline rushing through her veins, making it hard to think clearly. But there was no time to process what was happening. They needed to move. Now. "Come on, Oliver," Sarah urged, trying to coax the cat to follow as she took a cautious step back, ready to flee. But Oliver didn't move. He was staring intently at the spot where the rustling had come from, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. Sarah's stomach dropped. Whatever was out there, Oliver wasn't backing down. And that could only mean one thing: it was dangerous. Without warning, a figure emerged from the underbrush, stepping into the clearing with a slow, deliberate stride. But it wasn't the creature from before. This figure was different, smaller, human-like. At first, Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her eyes focused on the shape, trying to make sense of the silhouette moving toward them. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, ragged clothing that seemed out of place in the quiet woods. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. Too slow, too deliberate, like he was sizing them up. His presence sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had no idea who he was or why he was out here, but every instinct told her this wasn't someone she could trust. The man stopped just at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on Sarah and Emma. There was an eerie calmness in his stance, as if he wasn't surprised to find them here, as if he had been expecting this moment. Sarah's grip on Emma tightened, her body stiff with fear. She glanced at Oliver, who hadn't moved, his gaze locked on the stranger with an intensity she hadn't seen before. The man took a step forward, his voice low and gravelly when he spoke. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his words slow and deliberate, dripping with a cold edge that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "These woods, they're not safe." Sarah swallowed hard, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. She tried to keep her tone steady, but fear was creeping into every word. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Sarah and Emma. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that made Sarah feel like they were being hunted. Her heart hammered in her chest as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. This man wasn't here to help them. He was part of whatever was going on in these woods, and that realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Oliver hissed, his body bristling as he took a few cautious steps toward the man. Sarah had never seen him so protective, so aggressive. The cat stood his ground, refusing to let the man come any closer. The stranger glanced down at Oliver, his lips curling into a small, unsettling smile. "That cat of yours," he muttered, almost to himself, as if something about Oliver amused him. "He knows what's out here." Sarah's blood ran cold. How did this man know? How could he possibly understand what Oliver had been sensing, what they had been through? "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising with desperation. She didn't have time for cryptic warnings or strange riddles. She needed to get Emma out of here, and fast. The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "I'm not the one you should be worried about," he said, his voice dark and ominous. "But if you want to keep that little girl of yours safe, you'll need to follow me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Follow him? Into the woods? Every instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction, to take Emma and get as far away from this man as possible. But there was something in his tone, something that made her hesitate. He knew something about the woods, about the creature they had seen. And as terrifying as he was, he might be their only way out of this nightmare. But could she trust him? Before she could respond, a distant howl echoed through the trees, a bone-chilling sound that made Sarah's heart stop. It was the same sound she had heard before, the same inhuman growl, and it was coming closer. The man's expression darkened. "You don't have much time," he said, his voice sharp now, urgent. "If you stay here, you won't survive the night." Sarah's mind raced. She was out of options, torn between trusting this stranger and risking whatever was out there in the woods. The howling grew louder, more insistent, as if it was closing in on them. She could feel the danger pressing in from all sides, the darkness suffocating them. And then, in that moment, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep rumbling vibration that shook the trees and sent a cascade of leaves falling from the branches above. The air around them grew colder, more oppressive, as if the forest itself was reacting to something far more sinister than they had yet seen. The man turned, glancing toward the trees, his expression tense. "It's waking up," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Sarah. But she heard him, and the words sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Waking up? What was waking up? The growling, the shifting shadows, the strange marks on the ground. It all came rushing back to her, and suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This wasn't just about some wild animal stalking them through the woods. There was something bigger, something ancient and dangerous, something that had been lying dormant. Until now. Oliver hissed again, his body tense as he stood between Sarah and the man. But even the cat seemed uncertain now, as if he too could feel the weight of whatever was approaching. The man's eyes locked onto Sarah's, his gaze hard and unyielding. "You can come with me," he said, his voice low and serious, "or you can stay here and take your chances. But whatever you do, you need to decide now." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. The howls were getting closer, the ground trembling beneath their feet. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust. But time was running out and the darkness was closing in. Emma whimpered softly in her arms, her small face pressed against Sarah's chest. She couldn't afford to make the wrong choice, not when her daughter's life was on the line. But in the pit of her stomach, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming for them, it wasn't going to wait much longer. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the decision bearing down on her as the man's words echoed in her mind. She glanced at Oliver, who remained tense, standing guard as the growling from deep within the forest drew nearer. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was approaching was far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered, and every instinct told her they had to move. Now. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll follow you." The man gave a quick nod, turning on his heel and heading deeper into the woods. His movements were swift and sure, as though he knew these woods intimately. Sarah hesitated for just a second. clutching Emma tighter to her chest before stepping forward. Oliver followed closely, never leaving her side. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into another trap. But what choice did she have? The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness thick and suffocating. As they moved, the growls in the distance faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The tension was unbearable, each step feeling like a countdown to whatever was coming next. The man led them through a winding path, moving with an eerie sense of purpose. Sarah wanted to ask where he was taking them, but fear kept her quiet. She just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, her mind racing with all the questions she still didn't have answers to. Suddenly, the man stopped, raising a hand to signal for them to do the same. They had reached a small clearing, illuminated faintly by the moonlight that peeked through the trees. The ground here was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that jutted out from the earth. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone, covered in strange markings that seemed to pulse in the moonlight. The sight of the stone sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. There was something unnatural about it, something ancient and foreboding. It felt like the heart of whatever evil lurked in these woods. She took a step back, instinctively tightening her hold on Emma. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer at first. He walked slowly toward the stone, running his hand along its surface almost reverently. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place: fear, awe, or perhaps both. "This is where it all began," he said, his eyes never leaving the stone. "And where it has to end." Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. "What are you talking about?" The man turned to face her, his expression grave. "The thing that's been stalking you, it isn't just an animal. It's older than you can imagine. It's been awakened and it's hungry." His words sent a cold wave of fear crashing over Sarah. She had felt it all along, the sense that this wasn't just a random predator in the woods. But hearing him say it made the reality of the situation all the more terrifying. "How do we stop it?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The man hesitated, glancing at Oliver before answering. "Your cat. He's been protecting you for a reason. He's connected to this place more than you know." Sarah blinked in confusion, her gaze shifting to Oliver, who sat quietly at her feet. "What do you mean?" Before the man could answer, a sudden, deafening roar shattered the silence, shaking the ground beneath them. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. The creature was back, and it was furious. The man's face paled, and he rushed toward the stone, placing both hands on it as if trying to activate something. "We're out of time," he said, his voice frantic. "It's coming!" The ground trembled again, and out of the darkness the creature appeared, larger and more menacing than before. Its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah and Emma, and for the first time she could see its full form, towering, with long, twisted limbs and skin that seemed to shift between shadow and substance. It moved with a terrifying, unnatural grace, circling the clearing like a predator ready to strike. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There was no escape. The creature was too fast, too powerful. She backed up slowly, holding Emma tight, her heart hammering in her chest. But then something incredible happened. Oliver stepped forward, his small frame standing tall against the monstrous figure. His fur bristled, his eyes locked onto the creature's glowing ones. The cat let out a low, rumbling growl, deep and unnatural, a sound that didn't belong to any ordinary house cat. The creature paused, its movements slowing as it turned its full attention to Oliver. For the first time, Sarah saw hesitation in its eyes. Fear. The man's eyes widened in shock as he watched Oliver. "It's true," he muttered under his breath. "He's the key." Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Oliver wasn't just protecting them. He was challenging the creature. He had been all along. With a sudden burst of energy, Oliver lunged forward, moving with a speed and power that left Sarah breathless. He struck at the creature, and the impact was like a thunderclap. The ground shook violently, and the creature let out an agonized roar, staggering back as if struck by an invisible force. The markings on the stone began to glow, pulsing brighter with each second. The man stepped back from the stone, his eyes wide with realization. "He's doing it," he whispered. "He's weakening it." Sarah watched in stunned silence as Oliver faced off against the creature, his small form glowing faintly with the same light that emanated from the stone. The air around them crackled with energy, and the creature, once so powerful and unstoppable, now seemed vulnerable, its form flickering and fading as if it were being pulled apart at the seams. But just as Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, the creature let out one final deafening roar and surged forward with all its remaining strength. It lunged toward Sarah and Emma, its twisted limbs reaching out to strike. In a split second, Oliver darted in front of them, his body glowing with an intense, blinding light. The creature collided with him, and there was a brilliant flash of light, so bright that Sarah had to shield her eyes. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The creature was gone, and the stone's glow had dimmed back to nothing. Sarah blinked, her heart still racing as she looked around in disbelief. Oliver stood in the middle of the clearing, his fur ruffled but unharmed. He looked back at Sarah, his eyes calm and wise, as if he had known all along what needed to be done. Sarah knelt down, tears welling in her eyes as she reached out to stroke his fur. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really are our hero." But just as she began to breathe a sigh of relief, the man stepped forward, his face serious. "It's not over yet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze shifted to Oliver, and for the first time, Sarah noticed something different in the cat's eyes. Something distant, almost otherworldly. "Oliver was never just a cat," the man said quietly. "He was sent to protect you. But now his time here is done." Before Sarah could respond, Oliver stepped back, his eyes glowing faintly once more. And then, with a soft, almost regretful purr, he disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air where he had stood. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she realized the truth. Oliver hadn't just saved them. He had been watching over them all along, protecting them from a danger they couldn't even understand. And now he was gone. The clearing was quiet now, the air still heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process it all. The strange man, the creature, and most of all, Oliver. He had been so much more than just a cat, and now he was gone, vanished into the night like a dream she could barely hold on to. She glanced down at Emma, still nestled against her chest, and felt a surge of relief that they were safe. But the emptiness left by Oliver's disappearance hung in the air, a bittersweet ache that she couldn't shake. The man stepped forward, his expression softening for the first time since they had met. "You should go," he said quietly. "The danger is gone now, but these woods, they're not a place for you anymore." Sarah looked at him, unsure of what to say. She had a million questions, but somehow she knew none of them would really matter anymore. What had happened was beyond anything she could fully understand, and maybe that was okay. All she needed to know was that Emma was safe, and that they had made it through the night. "What about you?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from the fear and adrenaline that still coursed through her veins. "Are you going to be okay?" The man smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "This is where I belong," he said, glancing around at the trees that seemed to loom even taller in the fading moonlight. "I've been here a long time, and I've seen things that most people never will. But my job is done now." There was a finality to his words, a sense of closure that made Sarah realize he too was part of something much larger, something she couldn't fully grasp. She nodded, understanding in some deep, unspoken way that this was his world, and it wasn't hers. With a final glance at the ancient stone, now dim and unremarkable, Sarah took Emma's hand and began to walk away. She moved slowly at first, her legs shaky from everything they had just been through, but with each step, the oppressive weight of the night seemed to lift, the trees thinning as they neared the edge of the woods. The darkness that had once felt so suffocating now seemed to recede, as if the forest itself was releasing them from its grip. As they reached the clearing that led back to the path toward town, Sarah paused, turning one last time to look behind her. The man was still standing there, watching them from a distance, his figure barely visible in the shadows. And though she couldn't see his face clearly, she felt a strange sense of gratitude toward him. He had helped them survive, even if his reasons were as mysterious as everything else that had happened. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned back to the path, guiding Emma toward the faint lights of the town in the distance. Her heart still raced, but with each step the tension began to ease, replaced by a calm she hadn't felt all night. Emma was safe. That was all that mattered now. The walk back was quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Sarah kept a firm hold on Emma's hand, her thoughts a whirlwind of everything that had happened. The terror, the confusion, the strange encounter with the man, and of course Oliver. The thought of him brought a fresh wave of sadness. He had been her protector, her constant companion for so long, and now he was gone. But deep down, she knew he had completed his purpose. Whatever force had sent him to watch over them, it had known what it was doing. He had saved them when no one else could have. "Mommy?" Emma's voice was soft, tentative. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, glancing down at her daughter. "Where did Oliver go?" Emma's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of confusion and sadness. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to find the right words to explain something she barely understood herself. "He had to leave, honey," she said gently. "He was here to protect us, but his job is done now." Emma was quiet for a moment, her small face scrunched in thought. "Will he come back?" Sarah's heart ached at the question. "I don't think so," she said softly. "But he'll always be with us in our hearts. He was very special, wasn't he?" Emma nodded, her eyes growing misty. "I miss him." "I do too," Sarah whispered, feeling a lump form in her throat. But she knew that Oliver's presence would never truly leave them. He had been more than just a pet. He had been their guardian, their unlikely hero. As they finally reached the outskirts of town, the soft glow of streetlights lit their way, and the familiar sounds of civilization brought a sense of normalcy that felt almost surreal after the night they had just endured. Sarah's body ached with exhaustion, but the sight of home on the horizon filled her with a renewed sense of hope. They had made it through the impossible, and now they could start to heal. When they arrived back at their house, Sarah paused for a moment before opening the door. The house looked the same as it always had, warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the terrifying night they had just survived. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then pushed the door open. Inside, everything was as they had left it, but the house felt emptier without Oliver there to greet them. The absence of his soft paws patting across the floor, his purring presence at her side, was painfully obvious. Sarah set Emma down and glanced around the room, her heart heavy with the knowledge that things would never quite be the same. But as she sat down on the couch, pulling Emma into her lap, she realized something important. They were still here. They had survived. And though the night had been filled with fear and danger, it had also shown Sarah the depths of her own strength and the power of the bond she shared with her daughter, and with Oliver, even in his absence. Emma snuggled closer to her, resting her head against Sarah's chest. "Are we safe now, Mommy?" she asked, her voice small and tired. Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head, her heart swelling with love and relief. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We're safe now." The days that followed were quiet, peaceful even. Sarah and Emma settled back into their routine, though there was always a lingering sense of something unfinished, something left behind in the woods. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the man they had met, about the creature, and about Oliver. But she also knew that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some things, like the ancient forces in those woods, were better left undisturbed. Emma, too, seemed to have a newfound sense of peace. She still asked about Oliver from time to time, but as the days passed, her sadness lessened, replaced by the simple joys of childhood. And though they both missed their brave little cat, Sarah knew that his sacrifice had given them something precious, another chance at a normal life. As the weeks went on, Sarah found herself reflecting on the experience more and more. There had been so many moments where she had felt completely powerless, utterly terrified. But she had also found strength in herself that she hadn't known existed. And in the end, it wasn't just Oliver who had saved them. It was their love for each other, their determination to survive. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a gentle breeze rustle the trees in the yard. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, but there was something familiar about it, something that reminded her of Oliver. She smiled to herself, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. He was still with them in a way, watching over them, just as he had from the very beginning. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Sarah realized that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of the night. Carol,